Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and today we're going to be talking about the whole Easter worshippers thing. The term that was used by some people to describe the Christians who were murdered by the Islamic terrorists in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday morning. Now, when one person uses that term, which I believe Barack Obama was first, what you have there is a turn of phrase. When two people use that particular term, you'd have to say that you're looking at some laziness and creative bankruptcy on the part of the second person who's just plagiarized something that the first person has said. But when three or more people of profile start using that term, it's pretty safe to say that you're now moving into the realm of political speech. It's no longer just a turn of phrase, it's no longer just plagiarism, we're now getting into political speech. What is political speech? Well, political speech is the manipulative mingling of truth and dishonesty to foster an ideological narrative. Some people might call it verbal engineering, where you engineer language in order to foster a view of reality, and you do that to make it easier for social engineering to follow on from that. Some great examples of this in my country right now. There is an attempt to legalise assisted suicide and euthanasia. There's a bill before our parliament attempting to do that. Now, the supporters of assisted suicide and euthanasia, they don't like using those two terms. They don't like being honest about what they want to legalise here, because obviously it's not a particularly positive thing to be advocating for, to the idea of assisting someone to commit suicide, or euthanasia, deliberately ending the life of someone with a lethal injection. So instead what they do is they cloak their cause in euphemism to try and shape a different narrative, a different way of people thinking about this issue. So they use terms such as assisted dying, or medical aid in dying, or medically assisted dying. Now, what's the truth here? Well, the truth is that someone is dying. That's true. The lie here is when you talk about someone being medically assisted in their death. They're not simply medically assisted in the process of death. They are actually killed with a lethal injection on request, or someone prescribes them lethal drugs which they can take and use to commit suicide. So someone is assisting them to actually deliberately end their own life. But as I said, that doesn't have the same positive connotation. It doesn't suit the narrative. So you use a euphemism to try and reshape people's thinking about that particular issue. Another very clear example of this is abortion. Also another issue that is currently making its way through our political system here in New Zealand. We have a proposal that is probably almost certainly going to be turned into a bill in the coming months that will attempt to legalise abortion up to birth in this country. But people who are supporters of abortion up to birth in this country being legalised, they don't talk about abortion, they don't talk about ending the lives of unborn human beings. Instead, they use euphemisms such as reproductive rights. That's how it's being described in the media, and by people who are politically supportive of this idea, they are referring to a law that would legalise abortion up to birth as reproductive rights. What's the truth? Well, the truth is it's related to reproduction. The lie, of course, is that you could ever consider it a legitimate human right to deliberately end the life of another innocent human being. So what you do is you cloak it in euphemism to make it sound like something empowering and good. And you really see, interestingly enough, on this issue of abortion, you really see the stark contrast here, and you really see verbal engineering come into play in a big way when you contrast, say, the abortion issue with another issue about life in the womb. In our country, it's over the last couple of years, it's been quite commonplace to have newspaper articles or health initiatives that are focused on the whole issue of fetal alcohol syndrome, or women smoking during pregnancy, and trying to discourage women from drinking and smoking during pregnancy. Now, when you read media articles about that issue, they talk about the harm that smoking and drinking will do to your unborn child. But they don't use the phrase unborn child when they talk about abortion. They talk about things like reproductive rights. They don't even talk about abortion so much anymore, as they talk about the procedure. When they talk about, sometimes you'll see people using the phrase fetus, because we don't speak so much Latin anymore. We don't understand it as much. We don't realise that fetus is actually the Latin word for little one. And so in our mind, it tends to have more of a clinical, dehumanised coldness to it. So we use that term. But when we're talking about fetal alcohol syndrome, we talk about unborn children. These are euphemisms. They are designed to promote a particular narrative. It's political speech. It is a way of shaping people's view of reality to try and advantage your particular ideological ideas. So, in regards to what happened in Sri Lanka, what's the truth here? Well, the truth is that these people were definitely worshippers, and the truth is that these Islamic terrorists actually did kill them on Easter Sunday. But the lie, of course, is that these people, well, first of all, they don't worship Easter, so they're strictly not worshippers of Easter. Secondly, there's a lie of omission here. They weren't just any old worshippers. These people were Christians at worship who were killed. And also, a lot of these tweets, the way they talk about the act itself, they don't honestly name the true nature of the evil, which was Islamic terrorism or Islamic extremism. And this propensity for euphemism, however, wasn't something that we saw as much of after the Christchurch terrorist attacks, which happened only last month. People were quite willing to actually name the evil, and they were quite willing to name the victims. So, why this difference? Why the Easter worshippers? Well, I think it's possibly about ignorance or even deliberate unwillingness to acknowledge that Islam has a unique problem with terrorism. I'm a firm believer that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that it's actually a good thing to be honest about issues, particularly serious issues like this, and that there is nothing to be gained by dishonestly cloaking things in euphemism because you're afraid of how this might be perceived. I think it's better that we have a rational discussion, and we are also reminded to do so through that lens of rationality. So we're honest about the fact that there is a unique issue here with Islamic violence, but we also continue to have that discussion through that focus of rationality, which recognises that not all Muslims are Islamic extremists, despite this clearly being an issue for Islam. And surely we can have that conversation without resorting to dishonest euphemisms, but for some people, I think they're afraid of that conversation, or maybe they're ignorant of the actual facts here, and so they don't speak honestly about this. I think there is also an ignorance or an unwillingness, a deliberate unwillingness to actually acknowledge on the part of some people that Christians are now the most persecuted group around the globe. I think for some people that doesn't fit their particular narrative. They have created a hierarchy of victimhood, and it's fair to say that at the top of the food chain, the sort of alpha predator, if you like, in most of these situations in their mind, if not the very top or very close to the top, effectively is Western people, and in particular Christians. And so to speak of Christians in the context of victimhood, it kind of doesn't really sort of compute for a lot of them. They don't know how to make sense of this all. It doesn't compute. They're either ignorant about it or they're unwilling to actually acknowledge that that's a possibility. You see, after what happened here in Christchurch and that brutal terrorist attack that took place there where Muslims were targeted, we had several weeks basically where we had wall to wall. It was like every day there was another 2 or 3 op-eds and so-called experts who were claiming that New Zealand was a seething hotbed of racism and white supremacy. Now, it's not true. Yep, there are racist people in New Zealand. Yes, there are people who are white supremacists in New Zealand. But guess what? There are racial supremacists and there are racist people in every country and in every culture. It's a big difference. It's like a huge, it's like chalk and cheese. The difference between having a society in which people exist who are racist and having a racist society. They're two very different things. But what was being painted here was a very dishonest picture, claiming that New Zealand was a seething hotbed of white supremacy and racism. One of the more interesting articles I read was a lady who claimed that New Zealand was this seething mess and this awful undercurrent of racism and racial hatred. But then she also said in the same op-ed that she wouldn't raise her kids anywhere else in the world, that New Zealand was the best place to raise her kids. Now, I've got to be honest, speaking as a father, those two things don't compute. They don't go together. Because if I was living in a country where I thought it was genuinely, I really did believe it was a seething hotbed of racial hatred, and that potentially my kids could be the victims of that, there's no way I would be saying this is the best place to raise your kids and I wouldn't be raising them anywhere else. What that indicates to me is that in actual fact that New Zealand isn't really a seething hotbed of racism and white supremacy. It's simply the emotion and the hyperbole and the sort of extreme intensity of that initial situation caused people to perhaps blow out of proportion some of the bad experiences that they might have had here in New Zealand. But the important point is that after what happened in Sri Lanka, we heard crickets from those same self-appointed experts. There was just nothing. There was just radio silence. No discussions about what this could mean. No discussions about the deeper implications of this. Nothing. It was just effectively silence. And from what I can tell, this is basically postmodernist intersectionalism at its worst. Because basically there is no political capital for them in the mass slaughter of Christians, so they briefly acknowledge it and then quickly move on. But there is political capital if other groups of people are victims, and so they are quite happy to dwell on that and to utilise that particular victimhood for their own political ends. But here's the thing, you can guarantee that if a group of Christians had carried out a coordinated terrorist attack to kill Muslims who were worshipping at mosques, and they targeted non-European tourists in another part of the world, or even in Sri Lanka itself, there would be wall-to-wall coverage of this. Social media would be lit up like a Christmas tree in a lightning storm. There'd be no end of self-appointed experts decrying the problem of Western imperialism, Christian hatred, and white supremacy that plague our world. That would be the claim. We'd hear no end of those claims, just like we did after the Christchurch attack. We even had an academic here in New Zealand who appeared in the media and made the absolutely absurd declaration that what happened in Christchurch was an example of Christian terrorism. I thought this was the media overstating or misinterpreting what he said, but I went and read and watched the interview, and no, he actually said it. But we didn't hear any of that in response to Sri Lanka. There was no attempt to even dissect or understand what happened here, and I think a big reason for a lot of people is the fact that there was no political capital in it. One thing that you can guarantee as well, if that kind of attack did take place, there would be no referring to the victims of such an act of barbarity as Ramadan worshippers, just like no one called the victims of the Christchurch terror attack Friday worshippers. They were Muslims. People honestly named the victims, and they also honestly named the evil. Well, apart from the guy who was referring to it as an act of Christian terrorism. But in this case with Sri Lanka, and despite the fact that these two attacks, they happened about 40 days apart, I think it might even been slightly less than that, the difference between the coverage and the response to these two events was like night and day. It was that stark. Now, sure, some of that difference can be put down to the geographical locations of the two attacks. In the sense that, in the fact that basically we do have more of a concern for events that take place closer to us, that have a direct bearing on our culture that we understand more intimately and we are more intimately connected to, and that's only natural. But that doesn't explain all of it. It explains some of it, but not all of it. There's definitely something more going on here. And it doesn't explain these types of tweets referring to Christians as Easter worshippers and not honestly naming the evil that actually carried out this particular attack. So basically what you've got here is part geographical location and a big portion of ideological ignorance and prejudice going on. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves when things like this happen and we can see the political speech going on, that we remind and challenge ourselves, am I actually doing this myself? From my own side of any particular given issue, do I start with political speech? Do I mingle a bit of truth and a bit of falsehood in order to suit and promote a particular ideological narrative? Or am I actually willing to speak honestly, to name an evil for what it is, and to be honest about the victims? Or am I always looking for a political angle? Because I think one of the things that is really destroying community and is harming us in a big way is the fact that politics, and well, more particularly politicking, has intruded into our lives and into areas and places where it just doesn't belong. And so much now of society is now constructed along political identities and political demarcations, and it's actually destroying and undermining authentic community and our ability to actually find genuine peace, connection, and community with others, especially those of us, those who might be different to who we are. And the only way we can ever hope to overcome that is that really it has to begin and end with us. It has to start with us. And we have to be honest about this. So yeah, we should call it out when we see it in others, that's for sure. And I've got no problem at all with calling out these Easter worshipper tweets. But we should also remember to challenge our own thinking and to look reflectively at our own conduct and ask the question, well, do I do exactly the same thing when the shoe's on the other foot? Because if I do, I need to actually do something about that. The world only begins to change when we start actually doing something concrete ourselves. I think I've shared this many times before, but there's that famous letter that G.K. Chesterton wrote to the editor of an English newspaper. And apparently the editor had published a big op-ed piece decrying the state of affairs in the world, and he'd asked the question, what's wrong with the world today? G.K. Chesterton famously wrote back to him and said, "Dear sir, you've asked what's wrong with the world today. I am. Yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." It begins and ends with us. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how you can do that are found in the video description below. See you next time on Left Foot Media. Thanks for watching.